What kind of key indicators were you looking for when you would go out and kind of find your target list? Like, I'm always curious, like, see how founders, especially if they go to market side, think through identifying the right people to talk to and kind of refine that as they have conversations.
So some of it is just who are the people who have the problem. Some of it is trying to identify who then also contacts you back. There is a general rule that, especially when you're reaching out for advice, people are incredibly kind and like to cheer you on. And then you ask them to try your product and see how they respond. And that is a very interesting insight, because sometimes the people who would give us really strong, fantastic feedback, you've absolutely got to fit. Great, you want to try our product? Oh, sure, I'll try. Okay, email them, crickets. You never hear back. So you have to learn to listen to a lot of different things. In a very similar way of sales, you have to know human psychology. You have to know the way that deals flow. Somebody's not emailing you back. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they got fired. Maybe they got laid off, more accurately, in the climate of the past couple of years. Maybe the problem that you're trying to solve isn't the right one for them. And you have to figure out why.
What's up, everybody? Today, really special guest. We've got Janet from Scoop Analytics, and Janet has a really unique career path. So we're definitely going to spend some time diving into that, like very non-linear sales path. But I think a lot to learn for folks that are, in the SDR seat today, or maybe in a junior AE role. But without further ado, Janet, super happy to have you on the podcast today and excited to dive in.
Michael, great to be on here today. And I think the thing about career paths is they always look linear when you look back. It's like, of course, that was the next role. But looking forward, you have no idea what's coming next. So for myself, my original career path in undergrad, I was a biochem major and seriously was considering medical school. I was an EMT. I did public health study abroad. And I, as anybody who really loves pain does, I took the MCATs. And a couple months later, sat down to write my applications and said, let me see if I can do something else. I'm not sure about this. And I gave myself some requirements. I needed to find a job that could lead to a career that couldn't be anything related to healthcare, because I'd explored a lot of that. So as one does, I found myself being a BDR in San Francisco back in the early 2010s as a natural progression. At the time, I had no idea what I was going to do, but I was interested in tech, and that was a role where you didn't need engineering experience. So I worked as a BDR for a few years, went back to get my MBA because it turns out I liked business and I wanted to learn something a little bit more than the Business for Dummies book that I bought myself. From there, I went on to be a consultant, doing diligence consulting for PE firms buying software companies, and then went to be a VP at JPMorgan doing a 0 to 1 product launch, wealth plan. And then my co-founders that I met at my first BDR job called me up and said, we're starting something new. Do you want to join us? And it sounded like something different, exciting, and new. So I said, yeah.
Love that. Like, three big takeaways. First of all, biochem to BDR. We're going to have to dive into that. I want to know everything about like how different that was and like how you put yourself in that mindset of, I'm going to learn something totally new and just attack every day. The second piece, right? Like, okay, so we went from BDR and now we're at EY and we've gotten our master's degree. Like, that's another career change. And then back to startup world. Or I guess like really kind of like being a leader in the startup world. So like so many different learnings that you've probably gained throughout your career path from all of these different experiences. But I think like a cool place to start for a lot of the folks that maybe BDRs or junior AEs like on this podcast today is like, what was the process like from shifting from biochem to being a BDR? Like, what was the hardest thing for you to nail there?
I had no idea what I was doing when I first arrived. I'd somehow convinced them that after a year of working with rats, I could talk to people, because that was their biggest concern in hiring. And they told me a bit later, they're like, hey, you haven't actually worked with a human. You've worked with about hundreds of rats. And yeah, I was terrible on the phone to start. And I failed a lot and tried to fail quickly. And in those first couple of weeks, I was making several hundred calls a day. Because they always give you like the old call list to start with, the people they don't really care about, so that you can sound bad to the people they're like, this is not the person who just downloaded a product demo. And one of the things biochem taught me is that if you work hard and just keep trying, keep iterating, eventually you'll figure it out. So after being probably one of the worst people on the phone who knew very little about business, in 6 months, I was promoted to be one of the first outbound SDRs, because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have a formula, so I was just making stuff up as I went. And for a lot of folks starting out, I think it's easy to get discouraged. It's a really hard job. And even the founders that I know really struggle with frankly founding led sales because that's outbound sales for a product that doesn't exist. Very different. BDR, it's much more structured. Founding sales, sometimes you don't even have a product, but a lot of similarities in just putting yourself out there, constantly getting rejected, trying to figure out what the right authentic way to sell is for you. Because I remember when I was a BDR, one of the people I learned from, he was absolutely fantastic. Alex Friffleton, great person, very different selling style than myself. And I had to figure out what of his was very authentic to him, what was authentic and important for the sales process, and what was authentic and important for myself.
Yeah, I think like a couple great points there, right? So one is like work ethic. I also joined, and got into like the tech space through the BDR role. So I was at Klaviyo like 4.5 years ago, and started out as a BDR. And I think the work ethic piece is like the biggest differentiator, right? If you're willing to work really hard and be willing to get denied left and right and continue to improve and continue to self-coach. And I think the self-coaching piece is a really important one, and now with AI it's like a lot easier to do that for yourself. But like, are you willing to push yourself, and are you willing to self-improve? Because I think you're right, like you can't just necessarily learn what you need to do from all the other people. Like every salesperson has their own style, or else they come off as inauthentic, which I think really really hurts. So some great learnings there. So let's fast forward a little bit. You went from this BDR role, and then you went and got your master's. And it sounds like that was like to really kind of increase your business knowledge. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I done inbound BDR, S-down BDR, the kind of that early stage-ish inside sales, field sales. And I wasn't certain I really wanted to do sales for my entire career, but I also had very little idea what else was out there. I mean, I knew from LinkedIn, I knew from, okay, here's different career tracks, and use my BDR understanding of LinkedIn to reach out to a bunch of people who had MBAs and said, why did you get one? And then reached out to some people who didn't have one and said, why don't you have one? And had a lot of those conversations. And ultimately I said, seems interesting. I think I'll learn a lot. Great, I'll go. So applied to schools, got in and went to Yale. Because it was more of a non-traditional program, but I really liked that it had so much access to the broader community. And I've always loved learning from people doing different things. Some of my friends were JD MBAs, MD MBAs. Still was friends with the MDs, even though I didn't choose that path, and just learning from them. And then when I went to be a consultant, had to learn a little bit more Excel than I learned. Business school teaches you business, not Excel. So had to learn some of that, learned PowerPoint, and learned a lot about how, especially with private equity, more how the funding side works. That was one of my big takeaways, is both how consulting works, that particular toolkit and skill set, and then also much more about the funding world.
How many of the skills that you learned as a BDR ended up being like directly relevant to either getting into grad school and getting your master's, or interviewing for a job, or like actually, pitching projects or things to work on within the roles that you had after the BDR world?
One of the most interesting things was at Parthenon, one of the first days of training, they take people aside, and for any consulting project, an important part is kind of the background is interviewing experts. And a lot, particularly for diligence work streams, you may have 100 calls with experts. Those are spicier projects. Most projects, you have a few less. And I knew how to talk to people on the phone. And I think it's especially in today's age where people are becoming less and less familiar with just how to pick up the phone and call. And I'm guilty of that. Sometimes friends call me and I'm like, why are they texting? Don't they know I'm busy? I can't pick up the phone just out of the blue. And that's for me, who's made probably more calls in my, career thus far than most people would make in several lifetimes. But I knew how to talk to people on the phone, and most consultants just didn't have that experience because that hadn't been part of their skill set. They were much better at Excel, so we had, let's exchange favors here, who can teach who. But a lot of the ways in which you had to learn as a BDR and SDR were incredibly valuable. I was one of the few people in my business program who knew the sales cycle, knew about marketing, and how to close a deal. And many people, if you've been a consultant, if you've been an investment banker, you don't get to that part of your career path until you're a partner. much later on. And I had already closed, deals worth 6, 7 figures. So that was an incredible experience. There were other parts of my education that I had to round out, but knowing that was something it felt like something I knew where, hey, I have this special skill set and I have something to give and a lot to learn.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I think in today's world, like soft skills and drive are like pretty much two of the most important skill sets that you can have. And I think AI is like democratizing a lot of the hard skills that, have really differentiated folks in the market for a long time. And I think that's a pretty good transition to what you're building now at Scoop Analytics, right? You're democratizing the ability for businesses to be able to access their data, work with their data, and understand it really well. So let's talk about this shift that you've gone through from, early stage sales, MBA, VP at, I think it was Citi, right? No, Chase.
VP
VP at
Chase.
Chase. VP at Chase. And now you're building Scoop. So let's hear a little bit about that piece.
So there was actually a lot of similarities through a product launch at Chase and a product launch when you've got nothing. The one key difference is at Chase, you have a lot of people who will automatically use your product pretty much regardless, and there are levers you can get to pull for more or less people using. You don't have that problem and or luxury at a startup. If you launch a product, you have to do a lot because most people won't find out about it. And that's something where I think a lot of people who go into a startup and have a really cool new technology assume, we've got the best thing since sliced bread. Everybody's going to want it. You have to build a lot of momentum. Most products don't launch like a chat GPT. And also most products don't have $1 billion in funding before they launch. So 2 key things there. And for me, my decision to start Scoop with Brad and Gabe was really, Brad was a second-time founder. He's incredibly knowledgeable about the space. I've learned about it. It's the same industry that I'd worked in my first job. Brad and Gabe both worked at Burst with me, so I'd known them for a long time, and I was fortunate to know my co-founders. I know a lot of people starting. I talked to somebody last night who's looking for a co-founder, and it can be incredibly challenging. They're just, it's not an app for that yet, actually, that I know of, and I'm sure now that I've said that, somebody's going to DM me, and please send me a LinkedIn message for the app for that, because I have about half a dozen friends looking, and probably 3 dozen more that I don't know are looking for that. But it's an aside, co-founder matching it's a fascinating thing.
And really hard. And I think like most people end up doing it based on relationships they've had. But I've seen a couple instances, people going out and kind of like searching for someone and finding someone and running interviews, like really hard to nail.
It is one of the hardest things to nail because you have to nail so many different things about it. So, and if you have to make sure you're both in the same position, financially interested in the same type of thing. You have complementary skill sets. So I've seen 2 friends of mine who were great, but they brought the same thing to the table. So they know they can never start a company together, even though they're constantly saying ideas and are both brilliant founders in and of themselves who are looking for their second company, but they're too similar. And you tend to be friends with people kind of similar to you. So that presents another challenge. So it is one of the things I'm amazed by is how co-founders, the success stories. And one of the things sometimes do wonder is how many companies would exist if the other person had found a co-founder, but just never did.
That's a great point. Yeah, the untold stories of a founder who was trying to build something who couldn't get someone else to build it with them or couldn't find the right person. But I think it's a great point, right? So let's hear a little bit about the dynamics at Scoop. Like, what are the 3 of you responsible for? What's each of your lanes at the company?
So in terms of that, we got Brad's the CEO and is responsible for a lot of the back end. Gabe's responsible for a lot of the front end, and I'm responsible for a lot of the go-to-market. So we each have our unique value proposition that we built. And really the reason behind the company that it was founded was we were trying to figure out how to make analytics easier for the average business person. Every business user knows spreadsheets. Every business person that I've known is analytically savvy. Of course, there are degrees of it. There's some people who graduated with, I know business people with math PhDs, and I know business people who got as far as algebra and then said, no, thank you to calculus. But we all understand numbers. I know there's a constant joke where salespeople don't understand numbers. ask a salesperson, and then they'll get their paycheck and say, I didn't get paid out on this deal. And actually, based on the accelerator and the timeline that's closed within and the percentage of this and the years of the contract, salespeople are incredibly brilliant. Just most of the time, you don't have to use that math knowledge. And so, for anyone saying they're not analytically savvy, they just don't need to have those skill sets. And we use the skill sets and refine them that we're constantly pushed on in our daily jobs. And guarantee you, if $500 is missing from your paycheck, most salespeople point that out pretty quickly.
You're going to know. And then, by the way, once you get promoted into, a sales leadership role, your whole job is numbers, right? Who's hitting their quota? How much are we projecting? What's the pipeline? Like, it all becomes numbers, right? That's like basically the whole job is managing people, interviewing people, hiring people, and running numbers. So I agree. I think like math, very important skill, and like really, but like having an understanding of the context behind the math, right? It's like you don't need to be brilliant at calculus, but you do need to understand like your own book of business, and being able to project and like add context and nuance, and be able to understand like, is this deal going to move forward and why? And if not, why not? So let's talk a little bit about the early stage GTM that you've been running at Scoop. You guys raised your seed round, I think like about a year ago at this point, if I'm not mistaken. So talk to me a little bit about like what markets you've gone after, where you guys are seeing some success, and like what you think the future of Scoop kind of looks like.
So for the markets, first figuring it out, I talked to a lot of people, and that's actually where my BDR, SDR experience came in. I know how to find people on LinkedIn, and I know how to get them on the phone with me. And, sometimes people on LinkedIn will say, I'm happy to chat. And sometimes they'll say my rate is $400 an hour. You get both responses. You learn how to get more of the former response, because no startup founder should be paying $400 to talk to somebody. Unless there will be some exception pointed out. As a general rule, don't. And talking with a lot of people, we were saying our problem statement. We were refining it with them, refining it with revenue operations, different phrases of the parts of the go-to-market, different types of companies, understanding that. And then that first it was, let's validate our problem market fit. Which market has the problem that we're trying to solve most acutely? And then the other question becomes, who can, what are the barriers to sales too? So yes, our problem exists at large enterprise companies. Those sales cycles are also particularly long. Is that where we wanted to start at? And ultimately we decided, this wasn't the right start at the beginning. We were still going for our SOC 2 Type 2. We were still figuring out a lot of other things. And an enterprise sales cycle, I've seen on the short side 6 months, on the long side, I talked to 2 or 3 years, and then there's the government.
Totally makes sense. So where did you guys kind of land from like a starting point?
A lot of SMB go-to-market is where we landed. So go-to-market falls under revenue operations as its most accurate definition. So that is all of revenue. So finance operations, sales operations, marketing operations, customer operations, partner operations.
Awesome. And when you guys kind of thought about how you wanted to launch, right, and you identified that this was the right market for you, what kind of key indicators were you looking for when you would go out and kind of find your target list? Was it like tech stack specific? Was it, based on the type of company or industry where you noticed that there was particular problems? Like, I'm always curious to see how founders, especially on the go-to-market side, think through identifying the right people to talk to and kind of refine that as they have conversations.
So some of it is just, who are the people who have the problem. Some of it is trying to identify who then also contacts you back. So there's a general rule that, especially when you're reaching out for advice, people are incredibly kind and like to cheer you on. And then you ask them to try your product and see how they respond. And that insight is a very interesting insight, because sometimes the people who would give us really strong, fantastic feedback, you've absolutely got to fit. Great, you want to try our product? Oh, sure, I'll try. Okay. I can email them. Crickets. You never hear back. So you have to learn to listen to a lot of different things in a very similar way of sales. You have to know human psychology. You have to know the way that deals flow. Somebody's not emailing you back. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they got fired. Maybe they got laid off, more accurately, in the climate of the past couple of years. Maybe the problem that you're trying to solve isn't the right one for them. And you have to figure out why. So, one of the things I was talking about with a few other, early stage founders and VCs last week is that, you know, everybody is wrong for an early stage startup. You'll be wrong about the markets you're selling to. Your VCs will be wrong about the advice that they give to. The people who you talk to be your early customers will be wrong about the features that they want. Yes, some of the features they will, if you handed somebody an iPhone 10 years ago, or okay, I guess 20 years ago or whatever at this point, they'd say, oh, but it doesn't have XYZ. It couldn't possibly sell. The job of the founder is to figure out what you're hearing that is wrong and what you're hearing that is right. And that is an incredibly difficult job.
And I think when you start to layer on top of like what's wrong and what's right. So I had Alina on from Chili Piper a couple weeks ago, and she talked about how she started her go-to-market motion around pre-selling. So before they even built any technology, she went out and closed a couple 20K plus deals to go out and build it as design partners. Obviously not possible for everyone to do. Alina's like an incredible founder, and that's a really compelling story. But I think you're right. And as a founder, it's so hard to delineate what's real feedback and what's not real feedback, right? And what feature requests are actually going to get someone to do something versus what feature requests are an excuse for them to not use something that they probably don't already want to use. And they just feel uncomfortable saying it. Oh, well, if it had this, like, then I would use it. But the reality is, like, they don't want to use anything. The pain's not there for them. So I guess, like, I would love to kind of hear maybe your thoughts or framework for how you think through that on a step-by-step basis, because I think it's relevant for both founders who are building, but it's also relevant for sales folks who, might end up in a deal and they're like, well, I don't understand how I possibly lost this deal, but it was the nuances behind it that might have been the reason.
The nuance of the person not in the room. And that's one question I always ask myself. Who's not in the room on this conversation? I'm talking to somebody who says they love my product and they totally use it. Do they have permission? Can they download something on themselves? Like, what are the other factors going on that you don't see? This is a problem. Is that a problem for you? Is that a problem for your team? Who is that a problem for? So thinking through a lot of those things and trying to get as many viewpoints as you have. And a lot of it, especially in the early days, it's more qualitative than quantitative. I get a lot of questions, particularly as an analytics founder, around what numbers should I care about in the early days. And I'll talk to somebody, I'll say, your product's $100,000. You can't analyze your sales cycle. You have 4 of them. Like, that is just, you can't get number. There's nothing to analyze. There are points. And if you add 3 more data points, the line could look totally different. Different for PLG, where great, we have, 400 early users. But it's really figuring out what it looks like, what qualitative data can you take away, and not getting too focused on the quantitative data early. There's a lot that you can do, but there's so much that you're testing that it's more kind of a which direction is the wind blowing than, all right, is it blowing at 2 miles an hour or 20 miles an hour?
So when you think about like what a target account looks like for Scoop, and I think you mentioned a good point, right? Because there's SMBs that are selling 100K deals and they have 3 or 4 of them. And then there's SMBs that have 1,000 customers that are at 200 or 300K in revenue, right? Because it's PLG. Where do you think Scoop and the type of platform that you're building fits best into the market for SMBs that you're going after?
Yeah, so typically somebody needs enough data to analyze, and usually that starts with marketing. So you tend to have a lot more early marketing data than you have early sales data. And I mean, we're no different. There's a lot for any company. You should have more people clicking on your links and emails than you do customers. If that is ever reversed, call me. I will be very curious about the situation. So we typically start with marketing. And then for sales teams, which is one of the things that people always care about because you want to forecast pipeline, it starts to be, well, what problems are you having? One of the unique things for Scoop is we snapshot pipeline. So a very common question is, all right, it's June 1st. What did the pipeline look like May 1st? CRMs don't capture all of that. You can't see, was this deal stage 3 or stage 4? If you go into the opportunity object, then click on the deal, then click on the drop down. All right, this deal was. Now do that for every 100 deals in your forecast call. Great. Now your forecast call is 4 hours instead of an hour. So we do certain things around change analysis, process analysis, showing the changes that are just different because of how we store the data. in terms of more of a snapshot than a relational database on the back end. Um, and really where that tends to get into, you need to have enough sales volume to not have those 10 deals memorized. And that tends to be either a later stage company or a PLG company. For marketing, you need enough volume and you need a type of marketing that supports that. So usually we're more B2B focused than B2C. We have a lot of conversations with B2C in the early days. We're still talking to a number of different types of B2C shops, but tends to be more B2B focused at this stage.
Yep, that makes total sense. And I think a really compelling kind of value prop too. I was an AE at Klaviyo and a BDR there for 4 years, and that type of pipeline analysis, it was always just like on a monthly basis, right? Like, okay, here's my deals this month. Okay, here's the deals that slipped. Here's the deals that closed. But like being able to have a snapshot and analyze that really quickly and easily to say like, where am I missing and why, and what types of deals and what industries are moving more quickly, and where should I be focusing my time and prioritizing. Those things are really valuable and helpful. And I always thought back to like when I was, selling, and I still am. We do founder-led sales at First Touch, but being able to understand where to prioritize your time is one of the most important metrics to know, like the back of your hand. And it's really hard as an early stage founder. You're going to have to try out a bunch of different stuff. But once you start to find that early semblance of like what's working and where to spend time, there's no bigger risk than not spending your time in the right place. So do you feel like Scoop kind of helps businesses identify that and uncover, where they should be prioritizing and spending their time?
It can help individuals within businesses. Same businesses overall is so broad that I wouldn't want to make a statement and then readily be proved incorrect as somebody points out.
Sure.
Know, we had one early customer, they were going to use us for projections versus actuals. Their projections for Q1, which ends in March 31st, the projections for the quarter ending March 31st did not come in until the end of April. We cannot help you determine projections versus actual if your actuals come in before projections. So learning about the use cases, and that's true whether you're in founding sales, whether you're an AE at a giant enterprise company, a lot of it is starting to learn to pattern match and understand, and then talk to other people, say, hey, I've been trying to figure out this problem. I want to run it by a few folks. And that tends to be other founders who are slightly later stage. Just the same ways when you're first a BDR, you say, I'm having this issue on calls, and you run it by a couple more senior folks or an AE. You have to, regardless of what role you're in, have close people that you can have these types of conversations with who can provide you that type of honest feedback.
Completely agreed. One of the most important things to do early. And I think there's a lot of companies, and I think the sentiment is changing on this, but at least it used to be build technology, bring it out into the market. Build technology, bring it out into the market. And now I think we're starting to see more examples of people socializing ideas in the market when they're really early. And, technology like Cursor and Lovable, and like it's allowing people to put together a raw MVP and start to socialize ideas a lot faster. Which I think will be interesting to see like what the next wave of companies that come out are, right? Like, is it going to be a bunch of MVPs that were built on top of these vibe coding tools, or will it be, actually like a huge boon, and maybe like people are able to validate or invalidate their ideas much quicker? I guess we'll see what happens. But as you went out into the market and you kind of validated that this SMB space was the right space for you, were there any core use cases where it was like, hey, this is kind of the pattern that we're seeing, and we now, try to be really diligent about finding people that we can get into those same patterns with, or that have the same pain points?
My answer won't be as interesting because I've said this, but it was I'm talking about the B2B go-to-market space. And what I'm not talking about is all of the other things that we also tried. Whether it was, certain things around, we talked to some hospital. This is great. I have loved this during my time. Or we talked to, more of a real estate type company, and they'd say, oh, this sounds fantastic. You have to think through, is there somebody at this company who has this problem and will make the energy to solve it? because there are many people who have problems with analytics. I'm sure just about every person who listens to this will say, I have a problem. I've been actually wondering about the MQL conversion rate, or actually we're not getting the right leads from this event and why are they marking them in this lead ranking so high? Or, we turns out all of our deals are actually in stage 3 or stale deals and only 2% of them actually close. Do you care enough about it to do something? And that's one of the things that you always have to figure out is this something that people care enough about? And that's true for any sales function. Founding-led sales in particular, because you're putting an entire product around people care enough. But also, is this something that people will continue to use? So that's a lot of what I think about. To your point on, will this change how technology evolves, especially with how quickly we can build products? I think we're going to get a lot more products. I think what the factors will be for successful companies is how sticky are they? I know I've talked with a lot of VCs who are wary about particular types of AI revenue, especially in the B2C market, because great, you have a new filter for Instagram, you paid $5, you've got 1 million users. Will they switch tomorrow?
Yeah. The sticking cost is low. And I think AI tourism has made it so that both businesses and consumers are willing to try a bunch of stuff. But it's really hard to have a sticky product that isn't deeply integrated into the workflows of a business, right? So even if you look at like Cursor and Windsurf, which have become really large companies, the switching cost typically isn't that high. Although their products are really, really good, right? So it's like, okay, cool. Like I don't have a ton of reason to switch because this product is really good, but what happens when a product becomes better, right? And I think that's what we're seeing in the LLM space, which is OpenAI, new model, Gemini, new model, Llama, new model, and they're all putting out new models all the time. And almost on like a week, it's like almost too hard to track at this point, but they're outdoing each other almost on like a weekly basis. And for a system like ours, and maybe even a system like yours, like, okay, cool. Well, you got the new best LM. Like, we'll just plug that into our system and go. And so it's really interesting to be on the consumer side of the LLM race. But I'm curious how that's kind of affected or impacted the way that you guys think about building at Scoop.
So for us, especially plugging into APIs and for what we do, there are ways where it becomes very sticky very quickly, because analytics is, you don't want to have to recreate the wheel every week for your Monday morning check-in. That is, just ask anybody. You've got that one Excel sheet that it was created 3 analysts ago, and it's broken in 17 spots, but you still use it, and you're not sure what like 3 tabs mean, so you just kind of ignore them. And one of them has something hard coded. So if you've ever been in finance or seen that consulting spreadsheet, it's somewhere buried in your organization. You don't know about it, be happy. And analytics can be sticky like that for us. It's much more the companies I know having a larger issue tend to be the companies on a more consumer side, and frankly, the models themselves. So how many people switch between Claude and OpenAI on a frequent basis?
Or use both at the same time.
That I'm guilty of. I use ChatGPT for the image, and then I'll use Claude for the rest of the post, which thank you for catching the errors so I don't have to type edit anything anymore.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a great point. I think it's the right point, which is it feels to me like the deeper a technology company goes into the actual workflows of a company and into the data of a company, the stickier opportunity and chance they have, because it's not easy to replace, and it takes change management, and it takes momentum behind a project, and it takes a really big pain to say, hey, we've got this thing kind of working, let's do something new, right? Unless it's like 10x better, there's not a whole lot of drive to change it. So I think that's a great point. This has been an awesome conversation, Janet. I'll leave you with this last question. For folks that are on this call, or excuse me, on this podcast, it sounds like we're just having a conversation. For the folks that are on this pod, a lot of them being like BDRs and AEs, what would be your one piece of advice to the folks that are maybe thinking about wanting to start a company at some point in their career?
Every company I know needs to found somebody to start selling their product early in founding sales. So having the experience of a BDR and SDR is fantastic. Um, encourage them to learn more about what products are out there. One of the bias salespeople, ex salespeople I tend to see is that they tend to start companies that also sell to sales. There's a lot more companies out there. So if you can find something where you have a particular niche, whether you have an interest in med spas and wanted to create software for them, or you just are pissed off at every red light you see and think that there's a better way that it could be structured. There's way too few people doing infrastructure technology. So, granted, it's a hard space. So, it's a reason there are fewer people there. But what particular niche do you have? And then also, do you want to be one of the founders? There's a lot more operators than founders, and there's a lot of failed founders. I live in San Francisco, so I see plenty of people who are like, "Yeah, I'm trying this." I'm like, "This is your fifth idea in the 3 years I've known you." Um, so having that real practical operational experience, even if you're not a founder, that's hugely valuable to helping companies grow.
Yep, I think that's great advice. And I think you're right. Like, think critically about the skill set you have, the point in time. Like, there's a lot to consider. I think people can get very excited by the idea of starting a company, but it will be the hardest job that you ever have. Even if you're wildly successful, you will absolutely go through the mud and you'll have really difficult times. And for the 99% of us, you'll have really challenging experiences, and you'll learn a ton. Um, and, it may or may not work, right? And so I think it's like, do you have that risk tolerance to be able to take that big risk in your career? Um, I know for myself, like I love it. This is my second time doing it, so clearly I came back to it. And I think there's so much positive experience out of it, but is also the hardest job that you could possibly have. So I think that's great advice, Janet. Thank you so much for coming on the Revenue Room. Awesome conversation today, and yeah, look forward to hopefully meeting you in person at some point soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Let me know when you're in San Francisco.
Will do.